Hi everyone. I'm Ellie. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to my live. If you've been following everything, then you already know that today I'm going to be reading the first 4 chapters of my new book, Waking Rory, which released today. But before I do, I want to give everybody just a little bit of time to get here and get settled and tune in and stuff. So thought I would answer some of my most recent frequently asked questions that I've been getting from some of you guys. The first one is, are me and Cara still together? Which I find very funny. Just considering we just got married this last year, but the answer to that is yes, we are still together. I feel like 2020 has been rough on just about everybody, and so we're not an exception to that. But we're doing okay. Every relationship I think has ups and downs and stuff, but we're doing okay. And to follow up with that, I've been getting asked a lot if Cara is going to be coming back to the channel. The short answer to that is no. Cara doesn't like being on video, at all. She just doesn't enjoy it. So I'm not bringing her back onto my channel to do challenge videos or any of those. Although if I do decide to go back into vlogging weekly again, she'll probably be here in passing. And the last one, I keep getting questions about our house that we're having built. And we've had a lot of problems we had to switch contractors, and then we had some problems when we switched contractors, and then there's a thing with the bank, and now things are finally on track. I think COVID had a lot to do with some of that, but our new house is coming, so I'll update you guys when we have walls, because really nothing's changed besides now we have wiring in it. So I think that's it. Hi, Jenny. I see that you said hi, so I think I'm ready. I'm actually really nervous because I don't normally do. Normally, I can edit at least a little bit, and I stutter, so I'm a little nervous, but I'm excited to try out live, and I don't know if it's fun. I guess then maybe I'll do it again. So if you don't know already, so if you're tuning in and you don't know anything about the book, Waking Rory is a Sleeping Beauty retelling set in modern day. And it's between two women instead of a prince and a princess. So yeah, I'm just gonna get into it, and here goes. Mommy, read me a story. I practically flipped onto my bed, jumping on my knees on my lavender bedspread. I wasn't supposed to jump on the bed, but I was on my knees, so it didn't count. My mom let out a sigh, but smiled as she carefully pulled the covers out from under me and tucked me in. It was late, well past my bedtime, as it usually was when I insisted on staying up until my dad came home from work. My mom let out a yawn, but turned and reached for a thick and worn book of fairy tales she'd been reading from for months. Only one, she insisted, as she sat at the foot of my bed and waited for me to get comfortable before opening up to where we'd left off the night before. I pulled the covers up under my arms and wrapped my tiny fingers around a stuffed rabbit before clinging it to my chest. It was gray and faded and practically ripping at the seams, and it was still my favorite. From the doorway, my dad stood watching with a slight grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. He looked tired, too, as he pulled his hands from deep in his pockets and crossed them casually over his chest, like he did when he was waiting for something. Once upon a time, my mom began, pulling my focus back to her. A king and queen were blessed with a beautiful baby girl. Her name was Aurora, and she was beloved throughout all her kingdom. My mom read through the story of Sleeping Beauty mostly as expected from what I'd seen of the cartoon. There were tiny differences, like no spinning wheel and no prince dancing with her in the woods, but the ending really took me by surprise, as it often did with this particular book of fairy tales. And then the princess, under the magic spell, fell into a deep sleep where she would wait for a true love's kiss. My mom looked at me with a grin on her face. She loved reading these stories. But the prince never came, and some say Princess Aurora is still waiting. Still? I nearly shrieked. That's what this story says. My mom shut the book and pulled the covers up to my chin. Now it's time for my little princess to fall under a sleeping spell herself. I felt a yawn come on as my mom kissed my forehead and turned to put the book back on the shelf. The last thing I remember before drifting off was my dad's scruffy lip grazing my hairline before the light went out. Chapter 1. The handcuffs hurt. I guess that was the point. They had to be so tight that I couldn't slip out of them, which wasn't putting anything past me, as I'd done that before. I'd been in more handcuffs than school desks that year, but it felt different this time. Something about this was more serious. They were cutting into my skin where I couldn't move, and every time I did, they only hurt more. I knew the guys were trying to get the message through, but I was getting a serious shoulder cramp, and it was almost 3 a.m., so I was actually ready for bed. Not to mention, I had the absolute worst itch on the tip of my nose, just shy of my double nose ring. It wasn't like I was some hardened criminal anyway. All I'd done was a little underage drinking, in the park, on a school night, while putting my street art on a billboard. And I know a crime is a crime, but the fact that I didn't stab or maim anyone like some of the jerks being dragged in there should have counted for something, right? Whatever, it didn't matter anyway, because my Uncle Nash would be there any minute to bail me out like always. But he wasn't. I waited as minutes turned into an hour, and then 2, and suddenly the tightness of the cuffs was making both my arms ache, and no matter how many times I asked to have them taken off, the officer behind the desk just grinned like I was telling jokes. I kicked the floor with one of my Doc Martens, which only made him laugh. My butt was going numb. Fuck was taking Nash so long? I knew they'd called him hours ago. I heard Jim, the juvenile officer, talking with him over the phone like they were pals. I guess he'd gotten acquainted with my uncle, too. Of course they had, because Nash loved doing anything that made me unhappy, like leaving me chained to a bench at the police station for 3 goddamn hours. I guess I deserved it. I never learned my lesson. I sighed. Hey, Matt. I called to the officer the only officer whose name I knew. Matty, my buddy. What does a girl gotta do to get a glass of water around here? Stay sober until she's 21, he grinned, and I heard a roar of laughter from the front desk. He continued to work through the paperwork at his worn desk. I was pretty sure these guys had been there the first time I'd been brought in. I slumped forward, the layers of my brown hair slipping out of my low ponytail. Fuck these guys, 40-year-old virgins, I swear. Except Jim. His wife was nice. She took me shopping a couple times, maybe trying to break the ice, warm up to me, be some type of mother figure. Christ, I didn't need a mother figure. I needed my mom, and that wasn't possible. Still, I wasn't a little shit about it, because I knew she was only trying to help. I leaned back, wincing as my shoulders rested against the chipped white paint of the cinder block wall. I could do it if I wanted. Stay sober, go to school, keep up my grades, be a perfect angel, but what was the point? I'd been there, I'd done that, and I'd still lost everything that meant anything to me. And if nothing matters, which it doesn't, then why try? Why bother? We all end up worm food in the end. Besides, the only time I could stop reliving my nightmares over and over was when I was drunk or high. Usually, though, I had to be both. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, even being a minor with a rich uncle for a guardian, but it wasn't like I had much else to tame the demons in my head. You could get out of here sooner if you just told us who you were with. I heard Jim's familiar voice echo down the hall. He should have gone home by now. Hell, I thought he had. What was he still doing here? Captain goes down with the ship, not the crew, I sighed, still trying to get comfortable. We both know you're not the captain of that crew, Evan. I know they're your friends, but one of these days they're going to get me into some serious trouble that Nash can't get me out of, I finished for him, looking up at the ceiling. I know. They're always up to no good, and I'm better than that. Why do you stick around them if you know they're always up to no good, he said, coming closer as his steaming cup of coffee came into view. He was staying here for me. His eyes looked tired. Shit, that made me feel guilty. I don't know, I shrugged. I would not be doing that again. Shrugging hurt. I winced, trying to sit up. I think you do. Jim let out a tired sigh as he sat down on the bench next to me, set down the coffee, and pulled a cuff key out of his pocket. Matt rolled his eyes, trying not to look up at us from his paperwork, but I made sure to stick my tongue out at him anyway. At least someone cared about the ridiculous pain these cuffs were causing. If they were going to go ahead and send me to juvie, sure, I'd get it, but if that were the case, they'd have done it by now, and Jim sure as hell wouldn't be sitting here waiting on Nash. Once the cuffs were off and I was rubbing my nearly numb hands together, Jim tilted his head toward the hall that held his office. "Why don't you come back with me?" I nodded and followed willingly, mostly because I felt guilty that he was here so late. It didn't bother me with Matt or any of the other guys because they had to be here regardless. Graveyards were just their shift. They were here every night whether I was arrested or not. It just so happened that the nights were usually when I got into the most trouble. More importantly, they were when I got caught. And it didn't usually bother me with Nash either, because pretty much the only time he was home was on the nights when I got into some trouble. Forgive me for giving him a reason to use his bed. You'd think the pull-out couch at the office would hurt his back, but apparently he's so loaded he can afford a comfy one. But Jim? He had a wife and a 4-year-old little girl who he didn't tuck into bed because of me, and let me tell you, that ate at my usually ice-cold heart a little. At that age, my dad was everything to me, and if he didn't make it home before I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Same for my mom, so I guess I felt guilty about his wife now, too. Jim's office was small, with a tiny desk, outdated computer, and a worn brown leather chair. If it didn't have floor-to-ceiling walls, it honestly could have been a cubicle, which seemed dangerous to me, considering some of the juvenile delinquents were not so safe to sit down in close quarters. But he clearly wasn't worried about that with me, because he offered me a seat, and I took it. "Evan," Jim sighed, taking a careful sip of his still steaming cup of coffee. "I'm going to put it to you straight. I'm tired, Nash is tired, and I really think you're on your last leg with this one. And you know you're only a year from 18. I nodded. "What I'm trying to say is that you really need to think about your future. What do you want to do with your life? Because there are some jobs that even juvenile records aren't sealed for. But more important than that, if you get hooked with the wrong crowd, the wrong substances, and the wrong places, you could wind up dead, and that's not a case I look forward to seeing pass across my desk." I swallowed hard. Jim had talked with me a lot over the last 3 years, given me talk after talk, but he never really told me I'd die. Shit, maybe I was on my last leg with him, too. "I don't want to scare you, kid, but if that's what it takes, that's what I have to do." He grunted, standing up as I heard a shuffle at the door. Nash. I should have been excited, ecstatic, my hero at last come to rescue me from this hell, but I wasn't. Nash wasn't a hero. And even when I wasn't in trouble, he never really seemed happy to see me. In fact, if I wasn't in trouble, I could go weeks without seeing his face, period. Maybe that's why I was always getting in trouble. It was the only time he was around. I stood up and turned to face him. He was in the doorway to Jim's tiny office. My normal, dashing uncle stood, no tie in his suit, his hair a little ruffled. He looked tired. And not in the way I was used to. His 5 o'clock shadow was definitely pushing 3 a.m. His brown eyes, the only real sign that we were related, didn't meet mine, but went straight to Jim as he offered a less than firm handshake. "Thanks, Jim," Nash said gruffly, as Jim handed Nash my cell phone. I was clearly grounded from that. "Evan, let's go." He looked sad, and I pushed down the wave of guilt that came with the look he finally gave me. Jim reached my backpack and guitar case out to me, and I took them with a soft thank you, having to rush to catch up to Nash in the hallway. As I slipped the strap of my guitar case over my shoulder, my shirt rode up nearly to my bra. Nash sighed, shaking his head, but he didn't say anything. He was really tired if he wasn't commenting on my clothes. He was quiet, even as he led me out the front steps to the station, out the front doors to the station, down the long path of steps, into the waiting car, where Nash's driver was waiting. "Gordon," Nash nodded as he stepped into the back seat. Gordon held open the back door for us, and I waited, giving Gordon a quick hug that Nash didn't see. "Thanks, G," I whispered. Gordon nodded. He waited as I took the guitar and backpack off my shoulder and climbed in before he shut the door behind me. As Gordon climbed into the driver's seat and put the car in drive, Nash cleared his throat, and I knew I was in for it. God, let me be back in the police station. I'd take those handcuffs over what comes next any day. Chapter 2. First of all, I hate cars, especially when it's dark outside. I'm almost always on foot, the only benefit I've found to Nash forcing me to live in the city. If I don't stare out the window during a car ride and count the parking meters, I'm likely to panic. Or worst case scenario, look at the oncoming headlights and black out. Which is why riding with Nash just means I piss him off. Second of all, I hate being in cars when it's raining, snowing, or any other form of precipitation, in which drivers might be poorly prepared for conditions, which meant every day for Seattle. And third, I really hate being in cars with Nash, who is either yelling at me or talking on the phone, and to be honest, I'm not sure which he's doing most of the time because he rarely gives me an opportunity to respond anyway. Nash was yelling this time, going on and on about how long of a day he had, how work was killing him, and how I'd cost him yet another relationship. Good. That girl was worse than the last. He'd been on the bad side of more publicity in the last months since they'd gotten together than he had been since he got custody of me, and that was saying something, because I've been on the front page after an arrest at least once. That's what happens when your uncle/guardian is the head of a major international computer information systems company and who makes friends with tons of celebrities. You're forced to attend social gatherings, red carpet events, philanthropist galas, and oh yeah, you're constantly chased by paparazzi. And you're expected to be an angel, paraded around like being at those events means your CEO head uncle is not only a great businessman, but also a great dad. Of all the things Nash was, a good dad he was not. I'd had a good dad. No, I'd had the perfect dad. Good dads didn't stay over at the office 8 out of 7 days a week. Good dads didn't send their assistants to parent-teacher conferences. Good dads didn't try to be a dad only when the cameras were flashing, disappearing for weeks on end when they weren't. Good dads didn't try to fix everything with money, ignoring that most of the problems just couldn't be fixed. Good dads didn't expect a child to make them proud while simultaneously not being around to be proud. Why try if no one's there to see it? Evan, are you even listening to me? Nash snapped, causing me to jump. Add to that, good dads didn't snap like that. Gordon and I made eye contact through the rearview mirror, but he didn't say anything. Yeah, I nodded, though we both knew I wasn't. I was counting parking meters from the police station to the penthouse. It was how I usually tracked the time on these car rides. I'm serious this time, Nash continued, ignoring the fact that I hadn't been listening. I had to work hard to get you this internship, so you'd best not ruin it. Internship? I looked over at Nash, who smiled a sly and damn near evil smile. He had my attention and he knew it. I hated when that worked. One big word like that and I was all ears. Weakness, maybe? There you are, he nodded sarcastically. If I did that, he'd probably smack me, but it's cool if he does it. I waited until he turned away to roll my eyes. Asshole. Too many parking meters were passing by. We'd passed the penthouse. I had no idea where we were going. Maybe Gordon was driving in circles for all I knew. Truth be told, I barely knew Seattle, despite running wild for the last 3 years. I mostly followed my friends around, and I rarely went home the way I came. I know what you're doing, Evan, and it's not going to work anymore. I sighed. I will get through to you, Nash continued, but he knew he'd already lost my attention again. I turned away from Nash to count the parking meters again, but there weren't any. We were heading out of town. I looked to Nash, who had finally gone quiet. Sure, now he didn't want to talk. Now that I was wide-eyed and curious, he was all done. Gordon pulled into Chans and Coy Airport a few moments later, and my stomach tied in knots. Oh shit, he was shipping me off to boarding school, or military school. I couldn't decide which was a better option. A few turns later, and we were under a rather large awning, with Autumn, Nash's assistant, beaming at me through the car window. Autumn was rather underdressed for that day, or as underdressed as Autumn ever was. Her hair was up in a messy bun, and she was wearing a t-shirt and dark-washed jeans with her 4-inch heels. Her makeup was done, but I could still see her freckles poking through her on her nose, and the hairs falling out of her bun were a vibrant red. She gave me a swift wave. Why was she in such a good mood? It was only 4 a.m. Who was in a good mood at that early? Autumn and the other Autumns of the world, that's who. Gordon came around, and Autumn stepped back as Nash climbed out of the car. I didn't move. I didn't want to move. Maybe if I was quiet enough, I could hide in the trunk. Everything is set, Autumn said to Nash as she checked something off the clipboard in her hands. Anything else you need me to handle before we head out? Just the luggage, Nash gestured to the suitcases and garment bag Gordon was grabbing from the trunk. And you already packed some things for Evan? We did what now? I asked, looking between the two of them. They turned toward me like they might have forgotten I was there. You didn't tell her, Autumn sighed, reaching for the garment bag and suitcase Gordon had just set down next to Nash. You handle that, and I'll have Gordon load these up in the cart for us. Nash nodded, eyeing Autumn as she left. When his attention turned toward me, he cleared his throat and stuffed his hands in his pockets. He leaned his arm against the top of the door frame, looming over me. I hated how small that made me feel. I'm headed to France for the summer to assist our branch there with their charity gala and to work on a few other things. He let out a sigh. And you're coming with me. I opened my mouth to say something, but Nash held up his hand. You will be interning with the company for the next 3 months, and if you do well, we'll discuss our plans for you in the fall. If you step out of line, you'll be attending boarding school in the fall. I swallowed hard. And if you get into trouble while in France, he sighed, you'll be headed right back here, spending the rest of summer in juvie. Sound good? I looked down. Answer, he snapped. It wasn't angry, really. He was just tired. I think in his own way he was trying to teach me something about respect, but he was going about it all wrong. Okay, I muttered. He scoffed. Okay. What? I asked. Not a good enough answer for you? His jaw tensed, but he dropped his voice down to almost a whisper. Too many business types around, maybe. You think I get away with okay with my colleagues? I shrugged. I wasn't his colleague. I noticed his knuckles were whitening with the grip he had on the door. I really needed to quit the Nash button pushing game. Just so we're clear, okay is not an acceptable answer. I let out a sigh. I didn't mean to. It just slipped out. You're pushing it, Evan, he growled. You need to wise up. The way you act is disgraceful, not only to me, but to your parents and their memory. Do you know how absolutely disappointed they'd be knowing all the trouble you've been in, drinking, doing drugs? It was just weed. It was one time. I know about the pills, Evan. I'm not stupid. I looked down at my chipped black nail polish and clenched my teeth. The pills. Depression medication that I bought from someone at school. My one attempt at a healthier form of self-care, and he was pretending he didn't know I wasn't popping painkillers or Xanax. Your parents didn't raise a criminal or a druggie. Is that what you want? To be a homeless addict living on the streets selling themselves for a hit? Because hanging out with the people you do, that's where you're headed. I'm not a druggie. What do you call someone who does illegal substances? It was like talking to a brick wall. I shrugged. He fumed. Disappointment doesn't begin to cover it at this point, he sighed, apparently letting the anger dissipate. I'm surprised at you. Drinking, with what happened to your parents, I'm surprised you touched the stuff. He had a lot of room to talk. He had whiskey everywhere, including the car. I eyed it. He followed my gaze and let out a sigh. When I looked back up at him, his face had softened slightly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, tossing it my way. I examined it. This is a kid's phone. Yeah, you're right, he nodded, grinning wide. I'm going to treat you like a child until you start acting your age. It only makes calls to me, your boss, and emergency numbers. Let's go. Okay, I'm sorry. I need a drink. I know that this probably isn't, like, for everyone, not just the book, but also, like, this specific type of live. But I feel like it's going to be beneficial to all the people who've wanted to read my book, but couldn't because of, like, I don't know, they can't read books maybe? Because I've had a few of you guys tell me that. Can you guys hear me okay? Because I'm not 100% sure. Hope so. Chapter 3. If you've never been to a private airport, there's a few things you should know. It's not super fancy, lavish, or overly decorated, and most of the benefits of using them are for pilots. The only real benefit is the lack of line, lack of baggage checking, lack of, well, any major security. From the moment Gordon pulled into Coy and Chance airstrip to the moment I was buckling in across from Nash, it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. There wasn't a lot of waiting in line, no TSA searches, and I'm pretty sure they didn't even check our bags, which was good because I'd put my cigarettes in my guitar case and my fake ID was tucked into my bra. Nash handed some paperwork to the desk clerk and we were sent to our terminal, the McCoy terminal, only used by the McCoy plane. I couldn't even imagine how much it cost to keep his name on that parking space. If I was honest, I didn't want to know. As we made our way across toward the white and maroon vessel, our tiny crew seemed already ready to take off. A single attendant took my bags, but I insisted the guitar and backpack stay with me. Nash didn't notice. Our pilot was speaking with some of the staff from the airstrip outside. Nash and Autumn headed right toward the stairs and onto the plane. I looked up at it for a moment. The Miranda, conveniently named after my mother, but I'm pretty sure this wasn't the original McCoy plane. My dad, a rather skilled pilot, had loved to take my mom out for fun, but his plane had been smaller than this, or so I thought. I'd only ever gotten to see photos. Evan, I heard Nash call from inside, a slight hint of worry in his voice, though I couldn't be sure. I don't think he'd ever been worried about me. Coming, I called. I climbed onto the plane behind them, holding tightly to my backpack and guitar. Inside, the seats were maroon to match the exterior lettering. It was the carpet floor and the exterior, as was the carpet floor and the exterior of the compartments. With a large amount of effort, I choked down the scoff at Nash, who already had a glass in his hand full of dark brown liquid. Whiskey, brandy, couldn't be sure, but I didn't really care. He was always drinking, which only made his anger at my drinking seem misplaced. What? He asked, as if I'd said the words loud. Nothing, I shrugged. Where do I sit? The plane had a total of all placed well apart, with the ability to turn and face the group for a better conversation. I only hoped Nash didn't expect me to speak to him on the flight. 12 hours. I had 12 hours in a confined space with my uncle, with whom I'd long ago run out of things to talk about. Safe topics, anyway. Wherever you like, he gestured. It's just us. Perfect. Autumn had sat toward the back, her computer already out, along with some files she was working on. I chose a spot in the middle, knowing he'd likely choose one close to me. Of course, I was right. Once I made myself comfortable and the pilot had stepped onto the plane, Nash took a seat directly across from me. Something about the way he was sitting, his jacket unbuttoned, his tie nowhere in sight, his posture less rigid, gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, this flight wouldn't be so bad. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but sighed and closed it again, leaning back in his chair. You'd best buckle in, he said, pulling out his computer. Typical. The pilot gave the usual spiel, and within a few minutes we were prepping to take off. Planes were the worst. As we began lining up with the runway, I started my grounding ritual, but I had to do it a total of 12 times before we were in the air. What could I see? What could I smell? What could I hear? What could I taste? What could I feel? The last thing I needed was to have a panic attack on a plane with Nash. Takeoff was smooth, despite all the fear I had about it. It was quick, but it still made my ears pop and gave me a pressure headache. Nash didn't seem bothered at all. He kept typing on his computer like nothing had even happened. I guess when you fly twice a week, you get used to it. I didn't feel like I'd ever be used to it. The silence on the plane was deafening. The only sound was that of Nash and Autumn typing away on their computers. I didn't know either of them well enough to know if it was safe to watch a movie while they worked, so I pulled out a book instead. This grabbed Nash's attention. He looked over with a raised eyebrow as I pulled the book from my backpack, as if someone causes trouble on a daily basis can't find time to read. Joke was on him. I read stories that taught me how to cause trouble. I didn't feel safe getting out my sketchbook here. It was mostly sad sketches and poetry, but that didn't mean I wanted him reading any of it. At some point, I dozed off. It had been a long night, after all, and we were headed to an entirely different time zone. I wasn't prepared for Nash or Autumn to see why I stayed out all night, why I got so little sleep and needed a drink to numb the pain. The thing about trauma is that no matter how far you are from it, no matter how much you try to move on, it's still buried deep in your subconscious. You know, where you go when you dream? Your subconscious. And as it turns out, mine liked to take me back to the worst night of my entire life, over and over. I was in the car, my parents' car. I could feel the metal crushing in around me. Through a tiny hole near the window, I could scarcely see anything. All around me was silence. In the distance, I caught a glimpse of something moving. It had an orange glow about it. It was something near the size of a coconut, and it was buzzing through the air. It zipped about like a bug might do. I blinked a few times. The orb was getting closer to the car now, and there was something faintly familiar about it. As it grew closer, the tightness of the metal around me seemed to intensify, and it felt like a giant had taken a hold of the car and was squeezing it tight. I couldn't move my arms anymore. I could barely breathe. I was gonna die. I writhed against the grip on my arm, shaking me awake as I looked up at Nash standing over me. My face was wet. Hell, my whole body was wet. I was breathing really fast. I looked around. I could see the maroon seats, feel the blanket around me, smell Nash's cologne, taste the sweat from my upper lip, and hear the roar of the wind outside the plane windows. My breath slowed. I swallowed hard. Evan, it's only a dream. You okay? Nash's face was twisted with concern. He almost looked like he was going to hug me. Nash didn't hug. I'm fine, I shrugged, standing up, forcing him to step back. Where's the bathroom? Toward the back, he said numbly. Evan, if you need to talk... I'm fine, I snapped, rushing toward the back of the plane, passing Autumn, who looked up with wide eyes but didn't say anything. I would not let them see me cry. Evan, Nash called after me, softly, a tone of voice that didn't even sound like him. That wasn't fine, but I think you know that. I did, but I wasn't going to admit that to him. Can you please talk to me? I stopped just shy of the bathroom door and turned. I knew there were tears in my eyes, and I wasn't sure if I cared anymore. He'd already seen me crying anyway. I guess now you get why I do the drinking, huh? I stepped into the bathroom and slammed the door shut behind me. Okay, last one. Chapter 4. Evan, you can't stay in there the rest of the flight. We still have 4 hours left. Nash's muffled voice echoed through the cracks of the door of the small plane window. For a while, Nash had given me some space, but he was back. From the sound of his voice, he was standing across the small hallway. I'd been sobbing for the better part of an hour, partly out of embarrassment and partly from the emotions that always came when I had that dream. I knew both Nash and Autumn could hear me. It's not like we were on a huge plane, and the walls were paper thin. The only saving grace was the endless sound of the wind outside, but even that wasn't as loud as I remembered as a kid. I had just reached a very specific form of mental exhaustion where the embarrassed side of me lost to the side of me that needed to fall apart. Don't you have something better to do? I replied, wiping the mascara that had been rubbed all the way to my left eyebrow ring. Go take a phone call, answer an email. I heard an exaggerated sigh. The calls can wait. That was a first. I opened the door in the bathroom before I thought better of it. Why? Nash was standing in front of me, jacket removed, leaning against the wall across from the bathroom, looking more casual than I'd seen him in years. He didn't look angry, but more importantly, he didn't look drunk. It was, most likely, the first time Nash had ever looked concerned. Because he paused, letting out the nervous hitch in his breath. I feel like we need to talk. About the nightmares? I asked, because I've had them for years. It's always the same, and there's nothing you can do about it. You should have told me. When? You weren't ever home. He stiffened. That hurt, clearly. If I'd known you were dealing with trauma after the accident, I would have... What, Nash? I scoffed. You would have tucked me in every night, made me breakfast each morning, been a dad? Evan, no, you know what? I get I'm a burden on you, and you can't wait to get rid of me. No, that's not... Do you even know what happened in the accident? I was eyeing him for a hint of recognition. He shook his head. I was pinned to the back seat floorboard for over 6 hours before anyone drove down that road. He looked up, eyeing me intently. Mom died instantly, but Dad could have... They said he was... And I could hear him. He couldn't move, but he was looking for me, Nash, and I couldn't... Nash reached for me, and I let him. I let him wrap me up in a hug that made me feel like home again. He was so much like my dad in so many ways, despite how much he wasn't. And I just sobbed like that, Nash holding on to me for dear life. When we landed in Lyon, France, it was 1 a.m., which was perfect for me because I was exhausted. Gordon had stayed behind in Seattle, which meant we had a temporary driver in France. I hated new drivers. I could barely stand it when Gordon took a day off, much less dealing with someone entirely new for a summer. He wasn't a bad driver, though, and he was quiet, didn't take his eyes off the road. He dropped Autumn off at a hotel, but Nash wouldn't let me out of the car. Instead, he insisted I stay, and the driver took us toward the house we'd be staying in. It was raining, coming down in fits. Nash talked briefly in the car about getting a quick nap in before we had to be up for work. And with how wet it was, I could have been fooled into believing we'd never left Seattle at all, except for the architecture, which was much more beautiful, even in the dark, to have possibly been Seattle. Okay. He seemed different after the plane. Not once from the moment I woke up from that nightmare to the time that I was climbing into the car with him did Nash take a phone call. He was watching me. For once, he was the concerned uncle he should have been all along, and I hated it. I'd grown accustomed to the loneliness. Inside the house was beautiful in that modern way. Everything was white or black, tall ceilings, sleek lines. It was like Nash had brought his apartment with him. There was a small kitchen, 3 bedrooms, and 2 bathrooms. Much more than an average vacationer could hope for. The living room was filled with practically brand new furniture, and at the center, a large piano. I rolled my eyes. Nash loved putting me around pianos. He'd even taken the liberty of buying one for his own apartment so that I might use it if I wanted it. Had my way, I'd never touch the piano again. I scoffed and heaved my bag and guitar case past the piano toward the hall. I left the biggest bedroom for Nash. It had its own bathroom and a massive king-size bed. I settled for the smaller one, up the hall, closer to the front door, with a whole bedroom between me and him to grant me at least 1 ounce of privacy. Nash didn't say anything else as he headed down the hall to the larger room. I crashed on the bed without even unpacking. And that is it. That is 4 chapters of my book. I'm very excited that it's here. I actually had the idea for this book 8 years ago, and I think I just wasn't brave enough to write it then, and now it's here. So yeah, good morning, Christina. Hi. It's nighttime here, but good morning to you. Do you guys have any questions? Okay. Well, I'm gonna leave some more comments in the thing. If you guys have any questions about the book, let me know. You can find it on Amazon and other places. You can also find it on the Hanson House website, which if you purchase from the Hanson House website, then all of the books there will be signed for a limited time. So that's really cool. They'll be signed and they'll be personalized. I will be personally writing them out. So that's cool. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I will probably be reading the rest of the book just for Patreon on Mondays and Fridays. I think that was the most popular, the most chosen option. So I can't wait for that. Yeah, I will see you guys again on Sunday. Thank you so much for tuning into my live stream.